Welcome to Extraordinary Catholics, a podcast for, you guessed it, extraordinary Catholics.
In a world with over 1 billion ordinary Catholics, the Good Samaritans of Vatican-free Catholicism are truly extraordinary, seeking to model Jesus' inclusive spirit and his discipleship of equals. Like Roman Catholicism, inclusive Catholicism possesses valid lines of apostolic succession and shares valid sacraments.
1 in every 10 adult Americans self-identifies as a former Roman Catholic. If we were to band together, we would form the second largest religion in America. In Mexico, over 1,000 Roman Catholics leave the church every single day.
To learn more about inclusive Catholicism, please visit www.extraordinarycatholics.faith and join our Extraordinary Catholics Facebook group.
And now, meet the host of Extraordinary Catholics, the pastor of Holy Family Catholic Church, the only inclusive Catholic community in Austin, Texas, Father Jamie Matthias.
Welcome, Extraordinary Catholics. I am Father Jamie Matthias, pastor of Holy Family Catholic Church in Austin, Texas. We thank the special saints who helped make this episode possible. Corey Hurt Montiel of Holy Family Catholic Church in Austin, Texas. Bishop Theodore Feldman of the Sanctuary of Divine Providence in Birmingham, Alabama. Bishop Jerry Brohl of the Independent Roman Catholic Church in Wyandotte, Michigan. Bishop John Gregory von Fulmar of Solomon's Porch in Phoenix, Arizona, part of the Convergent Christian Communion. Reverend Canon Michelangelo D'Arrigo of Agape Fellowship of Atlanta, Georgia, part of the Convergent Christian Communion. Bobby Dukhan of Holy Family Catholic Church in Austin, Texas. Very Reverend Ben Jansen of the Congregation of the Servants Minor in San Diego, California, part of the Progressive Catholic Church International. Bishop Jeffrey Montoya of the Church of Christ the Healer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Heather Lucas and Jordan Dickinson of Holy Family Catholic Church in Austin, Texas. Luke Jensen in Farmers Branch, Texas. Father Scott Carter of the Pilgrim Chapel of Contemplative Conscience in Ashland, Oregon, part of the Catholic Apostolic Church of Antioch. Looking to earn your wings? Visit dwy.io/podcast to join the list of saints who are stepping up to sponsor future episodes. Can I ask you a favor? Will you prayerfully consider sharing a quick rating and/or review of this podcast? You are a saint. Now let's continue our exploration of the theological foundations of inclusive Catholicism. We continue the story of the matriarchs of our faith. Immediately after Sarah's death in Genesis 23, we turn to the story of Sarah's son Yitzhak in Genesis 24. In his book, The Gift of the Jews, How a Tribe of Desert Nomads Changed the Way Everyone Thinks and Feels, Thomas Cahill writes, Avram does not die before setting in motion an arranged marriage for Yitzhak, a colorless figure of whom we never hear much on his own account. But then think of the poor man's childhood trauma. End quote. Sarah's widower, Abraham, called his servant, saying, Put your hand under my thigh. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Yitzhak. Genesis 24, 2-4. So the servant put his hand on Abraham's thigh, Genesis 24:9, a likely euphemism for Abraham's testicles, the equivalent of raising your right hand and putting your left hand on a Bible, except that the Bible in this case was the other person's circumcised groin, the mark of God's covenant. Did you know the English word testify comes from the same root as testicles? I couldn't make that up. A Latin root, testis, meaning witness. Language is absolutely fascinating. A lengthy conversation ensues, which is important for its etiological explanation for the nascent patriarchal practice of patrilineal marriage among the Israelites. A bit of vocabulary. Patrilocal marriage in ancient times presumed that the bride would leave her family and become part of the husband's family. The opposite, matrilocal marriage, presumed that the groom would leave his family and become part of his wife's family. What do we see in this conversation between Abraham and his servant? The servant asked him, "What if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the country you came from?" Genesis 24:5. Think matrilocal marriage. In this etiological explanation for patrilocal marriage, Abraham is quite clear. He says, "Make sure that you do not take my son back there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there." Genesis 24:6 and 8. Think patrilocal marriage. So the servant set out with 10 camels loaded with a sizable dowry, Genesis 24:10, tasked with bringing back a wife for Isaac from among Isaac's relatives. We pause here to remember that the matriarchs and patriarchs are believed by most scripture scholars to be composite figures of saga, and not historical figures who lived some 1,200 years before the stories about them were written. The servant was looking for an omen. A woman in the town of Nahor who offered him water for him and his 10 camels would be the chosen one. Genesis 24:12-14. Sure enough, quote, "Before he had finished praying, Rivkah," or Rebekah if you prefer, came out with her jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. Yes, the same as the name of the town. End quote. Genesis 24:15. You guessed it. Rivkah offered him water, and then she said, "I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have had enough to drink." Genesis 24:19. No small task, since one camel can drink up to 20 gallons at a time. 20 gallons times 10 camels, that's 200 gallons of water to draw. Rivkah was the one, and the servant offered her a gold nose ring weighing a beka, 1/40 of a pound, and 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels, 1/4 pound. But wait, we just glossed over an important detail. And so we hear Rivkah repeat it. She says again, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, born to Nahor." Genesis 24:24. A detail so important that even the servant will repeat it. I asked her, "Whose daughter are you?" She said, "The daughter of Bethuel, son of Nahor, whom Milcah bore to him." Genesis 24:47. Who was Rivkah? Rivkah was the daughter of whom? Bethuel. Who was the daughter of whom? Milcah. And who was Milcah? Sarah's sister. Milcah is the bridge linking Rivkah to Sarah. That's right. Isaac, who was born to his parents in old age, was destined to marry his aunt Milcah's granddaughter. Rivkah was destined to marry her great-aunt Sarah's son. They were first cousins once removed, so their marriage would be outlawed in 6 U.S. states today: Rhode Island, Ohio, Kentucky, Utah, Nevada, and Washington. Quick fact, the genetic Russian roulette of first cousin marriage is currently legal in 20 U.S. states. And as if that weren't enough biblical inbreeding, Sarah's sister Milcah was married to Nahor, who was Abraham's brother. Genesis 11:26-27. The author of Genesis doesn't give us a family tree. Instead, we have here a family wreath. Let's pause to talk about Nahor. With Nahor, we see the first instance in the Bible of concubinage, the practice of having concubines. The author of Genesis writes, Milcah bore these 8 sons to Abraham's brother Nahor. His concubine, whose name was Reumah, also had sons, Teba, Gaham, Tash, and Maacah. Genesis 22, 23-24. In Jewish law, a concubine had sexual relations with a man without being married to him. There was no ketubah, no marriage contract, and there was no kiddushin, no ceremony of betrothal. A man was not obliged to maintain any concubine, and since there was no marriage, there was no monetary settlement upon the dissolution of the relationship. But the children birthed by the concubine were considered legitimate children of the man, and he could choose to leave them an inheritance if he chose. In the context of patriarchy, concubinage gave men sexual access to their slaves, whom they couldn't marry. And the children born by the concubine were legitimate, free, and equal to the sons of the man's wives. In crass terms, sex was part of the slave's duties, along with other work that she performed. In this story, we see that Nahor had a wife, Milcah, and a concubine, Reumah, who would in turn foreshadow Jacob's wives, Leah and Rachel, and Jacob's concubines, Zilpah and Bilhah. Back to the story of Rivkah. So Rivkah runs to tell her mother and her brother Lavan, Genesis 24, 28-29. Wait, have we heard that name, Lavan, before? Lavan, or Laban if you prefer, was the father of Leah and Rachel, which, if this story were historical, means that Yitzhak's son Jacob would grow up to marry his first cousins, Leah and Rachel. The servant leaves the dowry with Rivkah's family, Genesis 24:53, and takes Rivkah and her attendants back to Abraham, Genesis 24:61. As they neared Yitzhak, who was just coming in from a field where he was meditating, Genesis 24:62-63, Rivkah covered herself with her veil, and Yitzhak married her in the tent of his mother, Sarah. The Bible tells us that Yitzhak was 40 years old on his wedding day, Genesis 25:20. How old do you imagine Rivkah was? The Hebrew word for her is na'ara. Though often translated woman or young woman, it is more correctly translated young girl or maiden. In her work, In the Image of God, a feminist commentary on the Torah, Judith Antonelli notes that various sources suggest that Rivkah was 3 or 10 or 14 years old. She suggests that Rivkah was 12 to 12 and a half years old, which in the ancient world was defined as the start of puberty, the time at which a girl could be married off in a world that had no concept of adolescence or any notion of age 16 to 18 as the legal age of consent. Consider this. Only in 2019 did Pope Francis raise the age of consent in the Roman Catholic Code of Canon Law from 14 to 16 for girls, another sign of the patriarchal world in which we live. So yes, Roman Catholic girls and boys can now marry at the same age of 16. The author of Genesis notes that, like Lot's daughters, Genesis 19:8, Rivkah was a virgin, Genesis 24:16, which tells us that she was not yet subjected to the societal ritual of deflowering by the tribal leader who was her father, Bethuel. A Jewish midrash stated that Rivkah's father was a king. Numbers Rabbah 14:11. Various sources described him as a sinful, wicked deceiver. Rabbi Moshe Weissman imagined, quote, Bethuel, the depraved ruler of Aram Naharaim, claimed first right to every girl in the country who was about to be married. When the people heard about Rivkah's betrothal, they said, "Now we will see how he acts toward his own daughter. If he will do to her what he does to our daughters, good. If he treats her differently, we will kill him and his entire family." End quote. You gotta love the Jewish midrash tradition. So, Avram is no longer needed in this patriarchal story. He leaves everything to Yitzhak, Genesis 25:5, sends his other sons, the sons of his concubines, away with gifts, Genesis 25:6, dies at the good old age of 175, Genesis 25:7, and is buried with Sarah. Now that Abraham has left the stage, the stories of Avram and Yitzhak begin to blur, leaving us to believe that the storytellers who continued telling these stories over the course of centuries before they were set to writing were confusing details of father and son. Like Avram, Yitzhak is promised by God that his descendants will multiply and number like the stars, Genesis 26:4 and 24. Like Avram, Yitzhak lied to a king, saying that his wife was his sister. Genesis 26:7. The narrative now shifts to the successors of Avram and Sarah, Yitzhak and Rivkah. Like her great-aunt Sarah, Rivkah was childless, and then God blessed her with twins, an etiological explanation for the enmity that we shared for our enemies, the Edomites to the south. Like the people who descended from them, the babies Esau and Yaakov fought with one another even in their mother's womb. Genesis 25:22. Rivkah asked the Lord for the reason for this, and the Lord responded, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." Genesis 25:23. Like the Edomites, Esau was a ruddy, hairy redhead. Genesis 25:25 says, "His whole body was like a hairy garment, an appearance that likened him to a savage. He was an outdoorsman, a skillful hunter, beloved by his father." Judith Antonelli notes that Edom, the land of Esau's descendants, literally means red, and that Esau sold his birthright for a red lentil stew, Genesis 25:30. The Genesis Rabbah goes farther, saying, quote, "He was red, his food red, his land red, his warriors were red, his garments were red, and his avenger will be red, clad in red." End quote. Jacob, was a homebody who was content to stay inside his tent. Judith Antonelli notes how Yaakov, or Jacob, the progenitor of Israel, characterized the ideal Jewish man. She writes, quote, "Esau was a hairy, macho hunter, a man's man, who was favored by his father for purely sensual reasons. Isaac enjoyed eating the meat his son brought home to him. Jacob was the mama's boy, favored by his mother. He was smooth-skinned, gentle, and domestic. He preferred to stay in the tents a female abode, cooking and studying the Torah with Shem and Ever, end quote. Antonelli asks contemporary men whether they are Esav or Yaakov. She writes, quote, "Culture modifies biology and, as such, has a crucial responsibility in shaping men's behavior. It can encourage men either to be Jacobs or to be Esavs. Modern American society, which glorifies violence, and especially sexualized violence, and feeds men a steady diet of it as entertainment, teaches men to be Esavs. Pornography is the most extreme and direct means today for the Esaving of men. The media, of course, is not the only culturally sanctioned means for training men to be Esavs, but in our modern technological age, it is clearly the most pervasive. Sports, military training, childhood socialization, tolerance of injuries committed in male bonding, boys will be boys, and other psychological and sociological factors certainly contribute to the fact that even in this era of gender equality, 90% of violence is committed by males." End quote. Recognizing men's potential for violence, the Jewish law encouraged men to be more like Yaakov, channeling their energy toward prayer and other spiritual activities. Antonelli notes that Jewish men have traditionally remained outside of fraternities, bar rooms, stag parties, hunting expeditions, street gangs, gun clubs, and sports arenas. As a result, the traditional Jewish male has frequently been stereotyped as a wimp by the Gentile world. Indeed, it is a label of which he should be proud. The Jewish man could and should be at the forefront of the feminist struggle against macho masculinity, for he has not needed bullfights and boxing matches to bolster his sense of manhood. Hunting, Esav's greatest skill, is completely forbidden in Jewish law. Alas, however, as Jewish men assimilate into the Gentile culture, they incorporate the values of Gentile men. Thus, we increasingly find Jewish men striving to be macho and priding themselves on developing muscular bodies instead of analytical minds and gentle souls. The voice of Jacob has been interrupted, and the hands of Esav have been reinforced. It is time to turn the tide so that the voice of Jacob can be heard again. End quote. Yitzhak's birthright and blessing would ordinarily go to his firstborn, to his daddy's boy, Esav, except that, as Thomas Cahill writes, quote, "Yitzhak's lively and opinionated wife, who's also a terrific cook and a conniver worthy of her father-in-law Avram, looms especially large in these stories." End quote. A terrific cook? Yaakov likely learned from her the recipe for the bowl of red lentil soup that was so tasty that Esav was willing to give up his birthright to have it, Genesis 25, 29-30. And Rivkah prepared some tasty food just the way his father liked it, Genesis 27:14. And a conniver? She used goat skins to disguise her smooth-skinned mama's boy, Yaakov, and pass him off to his blind father as the hairy Esav. And Yaakov received Esav's blessing and birthright, which, like the sacraments of baptism, confirmation, and holy orders, leaves an indelible mark that could not be undone. In the ancient world, once you gave your blessing, that bell could not be unrung. And we soon see that Rivkah's trickery is God's will, and that Yaakov will be given a new name, Israel. to signify his place as the father, the ancestor of all Israelites, of all Jews. We need to note that her son Yaakov was a conniver too. He outright lied to his blind father to receive his father's blessing. Genesis 27:24. We can't leave the story of Rivkah without noting references to Hittite women and goddesses. Remember that the wandering Abraham bought land from the Hittites for the burial plot of his wife Sarah, where he too was eventually buried. Genesis 23:20 and 25:10. Rivkah finds herself in Hittite land, worried that her son Jacob will marry a Hittite woman. Seemingly on the verge of suicide, Rivkah now tells her husband, "I detest life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries a woman from among these Hittites, the daughters of the land, lama likhaim, why should I go on living?" Genesis 27:46. Of course, we recognize Rivkah's ruse to get her son away from his angry brother Esau, Genesis 27:43-45, but it raises the question, who were the Hittites? The Hittites were one of 7 people inhabiting Canaan. They ruled Anatolia, and 700 years before the scriptures were written, they waged war against the Egyptians in the Battle of Kadesh. And the treaty that ended that war in 1274 BC is the earliest surviving written agreement in human history. The Hittites were known as the nation of 1,000 gods, and their principal god, or in this case goddess, was the sun goddess Adiniti, the queen of all lands. Genesis 27:46 rings of misogyny for Hittite women and Hittite goddesses, perhaps in light of the Hittite practice of castration, which enfeebled captive enemies and criminals to humiliate them and keep them from procreating, and perhaps in light of the human sacrifice that was often linked to mother goddess worship. Judith Antonelli writes, quote, "The association of castration and human sacrifice with other goddesses comes from the linkage of blood and fertility. Because menstrual blood was seen to be the source of a woman's fertility, blood sacrifices were believed to ensure the earth's fertility. This is why mother goddesses were also goddesses of fertility, love, war, and the hunt." End quote. Antonelli quotes Eric Newman, who in his book, The Origins and History of Consciousness, writes, quote, "Her rites were bloody, her festivals orgiastic. Everywhere, blood plays a leading role in fertility ritual and human sacrifice. The great terrestrial law that there can be no life without death was early understood, and a strengthening of life can only be bought at the cost of sacrificial death. Slaughter and sacrifice, dismemberment and offerings of blood are magical guarantees of earthly fertility. In the matriarchal phase of fertility ritual, the Great Mother predominated, and bloody dismemberment of the young king guaranteed the earth's fertility." Antonelli notes how Hittite kings, who represented their gods, were sacrificed in ritual enactments of dying gods. She writes, "The list of Hittite kings are usually sacrifice lists. As time went on, kings substituted others, often their firstborn sons. Then animals, such as a ram, began to be accepted instead." End quote. Aha! And now we better understand how our neighbors to the south influenced our own beliefs regarding the necessary sacrifice of animals at the Jerusalem temple to appease our God. Like Avram, Yitzhak couldn't exit the stage, he couldn't die, until he arranged the marriage of his son, Jacob, who had received his blessing. Like Avram, Yitzhak was convinced that his son shouldn't marry a Canaanite, but should instead marry a relative. 1800 years later, the Kel Jesus of Nazareth would say, "The same measure with which you measure will be measured back to you," Matthew 7:2, Luke 6:38, and it's only just that the conniving Yaakov should fall victim to another conniver, his future father-in-law, Lavan, who made Jacob work for him for 7 years to earn his younger daughter Rachel, only to discover the morning after his wedding that the woman he married and made love to the previous night was his love's older sister, Leah. Remember, Jacob deceived his father, passing himself off as his older brother Esau. So how could he possibly condemn Leah, the older sister, for passing herself off as her younger sister Rachel? The Genesis Rabbah shares the wordplay that these two daughters, Benot, of Lavan, became the Banot, the builders of Israel. Leah and Rachel are the, quote, two beams running from one end of the world to the other. Genesis Rabbah 70:15. After the bridal week, Yaakov was allowed to marry the younger sister, Rachel, an instance of sororal polygyny. In return for another 7 years of labor, another instance of matrilocal marriage, a vestige of a matriarchal system. Matrilocal marriage was problematic for men. Had a war broken out between Jacob's father-in-law, Laban, with whom he lived, and Jacob's father, whose side would he choose? Hence the rise of patrilocal marriage, with its practice of the dowry, the preference for sons, and the devaluation of daughters, even encouraging infanticide. Fascinatingly, as Judith Antonelli points out, Laban represents, quote, remnants of matrilocal marriage in a growing patrilineal kinship system. Jacob served his father-in-law and not his mother-in-law, indicating that Laban was the head of the household. And so, with Laban's daughters, we see repeated the pattern of which we spoke in episode 5, where Leah was the unloved childbearing wife, Genesis 28:31, and Rachel was the sex object wife. After 3 sons, again recall the ancient preference for sons, Leah remained unloved by Yaakov, Genesis 29:31-34. Judith Antonelli writes, quote, Leah's desperation in hoping to gain her husband's love by churning out boys is understandable and sad indeed. Because she was forced on Jacob, Leah was not particularly loved by him. Here we have a faint echo of polygyny at the time of the flood. Leah, the childbearer, was hated and lived without her husband's companionship, while Rachel, the sterile beauty, was loved and cleaved to her husband. By being forced into polygyny, Jacob became caught up in this misogynist dynamic. End quote. Leah gave birth to 3 more sons. No luck in getting love. Like her mother-in-law who had suicidal thoughts, Genesis 27:46, Rachel cried to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Genesis 30:1. Realizing that God alone brings life, Genesis 2, Rachel offers her slave and half-sister Bilhah to her husband, Genesis 30:3, just as Sarah offered her slave Hagar to Abraham, Genesis 16:3. If you're counting, Jacob now has 6 sons. Jacob then has 2 sons through his concubine Bilhah, Rachel's slave girl and half-sister, then 2 sons through his concubine Zilpah, Leah's slave girl and half-sister. That's 10 sons. Leah then gives birth to 2 more sons and a daughter, Dinah. We'll come back to her. That's 13 kids for Jacob, 12 boys and their baby sister. And finally, after 13 kids, quote, God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph and said, May the Lord add to me another son. End quote. Genesis 30, 22-24. Before the story of the birth of Rachel's second son, Benjamin, which would result in her death, Genesis 35, 17-19, we find an interlude which includes Rachel stealing her father's teraphim, the idols of his household gods, Genesis 31, 19. And when her father tells Jacob that someone stole his gods, Jacob, not knowing that they were stolen by his wife Rachel, assures him, if you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live. Genesis 31, 32. I hesitate to even share the origin of these teraphim, these household idols. Judith Antonelli writes, quote, the teraphim were frequently made from the shrunken heads of firstborn sons who had been sacrificed. The hair was removed, the head was salted and oiled, and a small tablet of copper or gold with a name written on it was placed under the tongue. The worshipper or diviner would then light candles in front of it and bow down to it. The head would respond to any questions asked of it through the power of the name that was written on it. End quote. Certainly a more vivid image than imagined wood or metal idols. What a fascinating story that Rachel took the teraphim for her own protection and, if they truly worked for divining, to keep her father from knowing her whereabouts, which, perhaps due to his not having his teraphim, he didn't know for 3 days. Genesis 31, 19-22. Jacob's later burying of idols in Genesis 35:4 shows the Jewish ideal of the abandonment of such pagan practices. We also have the story of Jacob dislocating his hip as a result of wrestling with God, Genesis 31, 24-25, and of him avenging the rape of his daughter Dinah by Shechem, the son of the Hivite prince Hamor, whose name means donkey or ass, by murdering the men who were newly debilitated as a result of their circumcision. Like warriors of the time, quote, they seized their flocks and herds and donkeys and everything else of theirs in the city and out in the fields. They carried all of their wealth and all their women and children, taking as plunder everything in the house. End quote. Genesis 34, 28-29. Antonelli writes, quote, in their massive plundering, they subscribed to the notion, which is still common today, that the solution to male violence is more male violence. They also subjected the captured Hivite females to a fate not much better than Dinah's. End quote. Incidentally, Dinah's rape will be cited later in the deuterocanonical or apocryphal book of Judith, whose author likened the plundering of the Jerusalem temple by the Syrian Greeks to the rape of Dinah. Judith 9:2. Ready for the villainization of Dinah? We note that in a patriarchal society, Dinah was blamed for her own rape because she went out to see the daughters of the Lamb, La Malikaim, Genesis 34:1, a phrase we previously heard in reference to the Hittites in Genesis 27:46, now referring here to the Hivites. Like women who have been blamed by misogynists as a result of Chava's purported action, misogynists also proof-texted Dinah to explain how women, in the words of the Genesis Rabbah, constantly wander around for no good reason. We previously suggested that patriarchal societies always have means of control and separation. We see this in the story of Dinah, a story of male dominance and female seclusion. I'm personally fond of Judith Antonelli's retort. She writes, quote, "Imagine if an all-female rabbinate sat around thinking up such vicious commentary on men, concluding that the actions of one man in one particular set of circumstances is indicative of all men at all times. This is what it would sound like. Men possess 6 traits. They are cowards. Adam blamed Chava. Liars. Abraham said Sarah was his sister. Cheaters. Jacob pretended to be Esau. Gang rapists. The men of Benjamin, Judges 19. Adulterers and murderers. King David slept with Bathsheba and then had her husband killed. 2 Samuel 11, 2-17. And so we continue our journey through sacred scriptures that reflect the androcentric, patriarchal, and often misogynistic societies in which they were written. It's time for us to leave that world in the past and to create a better, more loving and egalitarian future for our children and for their children and for all the generations who will come after us. Ordinary Catholics might tell these stories in ways that justify their own marginalization of our sisters, our mothers and daughters and granddaughters. Let's not be ordinary Catholics. Let's be extraordinary Catholics.
Thank you for joining us for Extraordinary Catholics podcast with Father Jamie Mathias.
Check out our directory of over 2,000 inclusive Catholic clergy at www.extraordinarycatholics.faith.
Have an extraordinary day.